pleased to welcome each and every one of you tonight. We actually sold out so quickly that the education team scuttled to come up with this new arrangement in this gallery as well as in the lecture room. So we are all lucky to be here this evening. I am delighted to welcome David Adjaye back to Cooper Hewitt. As all of you, I hope, know, David is the curator of our exhibition, David Adjaye Selects, now on view in the Marks Gallery. So far in this exhibition series, we have invited 12 prominent artists, designers, thinkers to mine and interpret our collection of over 210,000 design objects. And if you haven't heard already, fashion designer and National Design Award winner Tom Brown will curate our next Selects exhibition, which opens on March 4th. What I love about the series is how guest curators hone in and bring light to some truly spectacular works in the collection, including so many works that have often never been on view. Such was the case with David. When David first came to Cooper Hewitt, he met with dozens of curators here, starting with our prints and drawings curator, who showed him some very gorgeous architectural prints. And David said, no thank you. And he moved on until he finally met with our Curator of Textiles. And when he learned the collection of textiles, which boasts 28,000 pieces dating from the Han Dynasty to a 3D printed textile made just a few months ago, when he learned that it contained over 140 examples of Western and Central African textiles, that was it. An architect who spent 11 years traveling through Africa, David visited more than 50 cities to study and document the continent's astonishing variety of design practices. This is the first time these 14 textiles David shows from our collection have been exhibited, installed in the gallery on a beautiful armature David designed for the room. So, if you haven't yet seen this extraordinary installation, don't walk, run, because it closes in just 10 days. David is widely celebrated for his fluid integration of African design traditions into the language of contemporary architecture. Founder and principal architect of Adjaye Associates, David's growing portfolio of some 50 built projects on 4 continents will soon include, of course, the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture. In fact, it was just announced 3 days ago that the museum will open on September 24th, and that President Obama will be cutting the ribbon. In what I expect will be the first of many awards for this project, Wallpaper Magazine gave the museum its 2016 Best Cultural Draw Award. And the accolades keep coming. It was recently revealed that Adjaye Associates is on the short list to design the Obama Presidential Library, an enormous and well-deserved honor. And of course, we are thrilled here in New York that David will be bringing new life to the Studio Museum in 2019. This afternoon, David paid a surprise visit to our high school design prep class and took part in the students' critique of their design project. So a huge thank you to David for that participation. I spoke to one of the kids and he said, it was just awesome, it was just awesome. And one last special shout out to Noel. Noel and David collaborated on a stunning, that's our elevator in the back of us. And I have to add that all of us Cooper Hewittians here today are a little bit exhausted because we are installing the next installment of the Design Triennial, which opens in 8 days. So that's why you're hearing that. There are people working on the 3rd floor, and I look forward to seeing you all when the show opens. So anyways, a little reason for the noises behind me. Back to Noel. Thanks to the generosity of Noel, a portion of the sales of these beautiful textiles that David designed that reference specific works from the Cooper Hewitt collection. They benefit our Textiles Acquisition Fund, which is quite wonderful. You too can acquire David's Cairo design for Noel exclusively from the shop at Cooper Hewitt. I can't help but make that call out. For our program tonight, David will be in conversation with Susan Brown, our Associate Curator of Textiles, who partnered with David from the very start on the making of this beautiful exhibition. So please join me in a warm welcome for David and Susan.
Thank you. It's nice to see this long gallery full of people. And thank you, Cooper, for allowing me to lay in your being inspired by several shows that I'd seen in that incredible room, so it was a real honor to do it. Susan and I are going to talk about textiles afterwards, and I don't know what the questions are, but we're going to talk about textiles afterwards. I'm going to just take you through a series of scales of my design practice, and I'm hoping that maybe there's a methodology which is always looking for a way to find the figure, find the pattern maybe, which is a kind of recurring strategy in all the works through different scales. And I thought I'd just go through about 5 projects very quickly, which start from the chair that I did with Noel. And Noel are my collaborators who I've been collaborating with for the last 3 years, both on furniture and now textiles. So sort of thankful to them for allowing me to play in their R&D and experimental and incredible sort of teams that make things happen. Noel kind of asked me to design a chair for the studio range that was part of the studio is something they do I think every 10 years, something like that. And it's a kind of moment where they kind of make a large investment in a piece of furniture, which hopefully, if it does well, will be part of their stable. And they had asked me to do a chair. I'm not a chair designer, and I was very traumatized by that ask. And in fact, who asked me, I kind of ignored, I think, for a year because I just didn't know what to do. Until I think Andrew and Ben came over to my studio and started more or less trying to, show me that actually designing furniture was not too different from what I was doing with buildings. But I became very fascinated with when I finally locked into it, the idea of making a chair which was going to somehow be about the expression of the body. In a way, for me, the evolution of the chair, from its timber, throne-like, throne, sort of symbolic relationship through to the classical period and its kind of upholstering, more sort of democratizing role to the 20th century, where you have new material technology making cantilevers and expressing new materials, was really fascinating as a kind of trajectory. And I wanted to see if at the beginning of this century one could make a chair that would explore some techniques which are old but also new. And could actually maybe start to kind of create a piece of furniture which would follow the figure of the body very specifically. So that, in a way, in the beginning, was very much this idea of the silhouette, the body as a kind of in recline, was very much a drawing that I was making everywhere. And this idea of trying to make a prop that didn't make sense was interesting. It's funny to say that in design, to sort of make a cantilever and then to prop something against it. Lots of studies later, and essentially in the beginning, the body of the chair was an exploration of first pattern making, and really being frustrated by not having any kind of rigor to that pattern making. Finally started to kind of work with the engineers in Noel's incredible technical team to map the forces of the body in that form, in the form of the chair. And in that mapping of the forces of the body, this pattern started to emerge. And what started to happen was that finally a way of kind of making a matrix out of that posture started to become the meaning of the pattern. So the pattern, which a lot of people think is maybe just drawn by me as a kind of figure, really became something that came out of a way of making, of modeling, and of describing the body in that reclined position of thick and thin profiles. So the beginning, there were patterns that were being sort of explored. These things, and each one of them really didn't, satisfy a kind of end game, and it felt like they could go on and on and on. We made so many studies of molds, and in the end, the form which becomes these V shapes and these verticals that thin out and fade to thin sort of edges and thick bases to kind of support the body, in metal and in plastic. Plastic really becoming much more solid, metal becoming thicker, but always this idea of expressing the thickness and thinness of the material became the kind of guiding nature of the furniture, and became sort of emerged a motif. There were some moments of kind of very simple, additions. Some of these lines were not joined, and I would join them. So in a way, there's a kind of authoring that kind of goes into the very technical form, and then in the end, these forms are tested. This piece of furniture went through extraordinary tests, incredible safety standards. I realize that chairs, architects like to draw furniture, and we realize we have no idea what we're doing. Furniture is this incredible discipline which has to do so much and has to endure so much to be able to kind of be a product out there. I wanted the back to be flexible, but in being flexible, it also had to kind of endure all these incredible stress tests. So this chair in the end rocks. It has a kind of a rocking motion to it, the plastic one, and then the metal one is rigid. And I call it sort of skin and skeleton. And one is a plastic chair, which is mostly indoor, and then the metal chair is an outdoor piece of furniture. They're made out of special plastic, polypropylene plastic, and then a sort of cast aluminium. And in the end, this is the pattern, and this is the sort of the three drawings of the form, and it's really a more or less an exact expression of that force, of the force of the body in that position. And then the plastic one, when this idea of a hybrid laminating piece of material with the same pattern acting as structure, not as decoration, creates this thin sort of hybrid member, sort of almost hybrid sort of member. And then the collection in its different finishes, and you can imagine how it becomes. And in looking at it, the cast option became an option where I became very interested in the idea of making a chair that could oxidize and have patina and record and register and weather of the body, or be pristine as well. So we explored finishes which allowed us to kind of make a copper finish, a bronze brass finish. Sort of almost as the kind of chair was being finished, I became also very interested in shell structures and how taking a simple form and then bending it or twisting it could actually kind of create compositions which could almost be like archetypal forms, geometries. And this was something I've been working on for a long time, this idea of a form which is almost like a building, but really was scaleless. And it was this idea of taking a sheet, cutting an arc, and then folding it inwards, would create an incredibly strong three-dimensional arch, and then finding a very simple clipping mechanism to bring them together to create a structure. And then to really, this distortion that is created can be explored as a kind of property of the two natures of the material. So this is the sand cast. This is a bronze version. There's an aluminium version, and it's basically sand cast with these formers, and then struck. They're 4 equal pieces, and the distortion of the curve, which creates the strength, the extra rigidity and strength, is then polished so that the inside of what is the table, it's basically a coffee table, becomes this kind of optical sort of reflecting member, and then the exterior is very matte and metal as it comes out of the sand cast. So this idea of kind of these dualities, but also creating a geometry of something very simple, which you just want to create some solid bronze version. But also this aluminium. And then it goes on. This is the last issue. The latest piece of furniture, which is Oh, that's much better. Sorry. The lounge show became really an exploration in trying to see if we could make something that was more, really took its inspiration from the chair, the skeleton and skin chair, the V and the sort of faceting forms that were coming from it, and to see if we could then make a form which was more sculptural and less furniture-like. So in a way, kind of, almost as though one had got a large object and had shaped it and cut it to create a series of contours, a series of diamonds of faceting that would create the lounge chair series. So again, a lot of studies were made. You can see there's a kind of fragments of the chair where the sort of geometries were coming from, and then from that geometry, as three-dimensional tests were made, and then the first prototypes were made, and then this chair was just launched. And it made a series of parts that went with it, so a footrest or a stool, which then forms, and then eventually we also made a side table that goes with it. So it became this kind of triptych that could be sold, can be separate, but is a kind of composition. And the idea is that it becomes a kind of composition in a space. So it's a piece of furniture, it's incredibly comfortable, this rotates, it spins, but it has this very sculptural quality. So it's sort of working almost against the idea of a kind of traditional piece of furniture. It's more like an object, but it actually performs very much like a piece of furniture. It's ergonomically tested against all the kind of criteria, and has this kind of mobility which you don't think it would have, because it works as a counterbalance, so that the whole thing just spins round and round on its base. So that's sort of small-scale objects, and that's really been the last 5 years, I guess, 4 or 5 years of working at that scale. But just going backwards, before that, a project that I completed in Gwangju for a biennial there in 2013 was also incredibly important. This is in Gwangju in South Korea. And the biennial is an extraordinary thing where the city actually commissions every 2 years a curator who curates architects to make structures that are kept permanently in the city. So the city is a continual iteration of design ideas which are adding to the public life of the city. And I thought that it's a fascinating program. It's not the idea of the pavilion as a kind of temporary prop, but it's the pavilion as a kind of an opportunity to always continually question the city. I collaborated with Adjaye Associates, a friend of mine, and this is Nicholas Hirsch, that director that year, and our thoughts, we went back to Gwangju, which is actually an incredible city that stood for democracy against a lot of sort of dictatorial regime, and liberate. It was part of a kind of liberation front, and has an incredible literacy culture in this small community. And when we visited, we were shocked how books were very much part of the fabric of society. Books are exchanged, people go in cafes and leave their books on tables for other people to use. Newspapers are folded really nicely and left on benches. There's this kind of extraordinary relationship to literature, which we found really powerful. We were asked to find a site, and I became really fascinated by these historical reconstructions of viewing pavilions, which were perched on sort of very undesigned industrial perches, which were basically the access ways for getting down to the water. And the waterway basically has a kind of extraordinary tidal relationship. When it's full tide, it can come right up to that point. And then in the summer, it drains right down to almost being a sort of very, very low stream. And so the city really kind of organizes itself around. So I became very interested in these infrastructures and asked if I could get the budget for one of these things that were being built sort of along the city, and that would be my pavilion for the community. But I wanted to learn from this and this, but to make a new thing, and also to then turn it into an open, what we said, an open library, an open space for exchange. So we got given a really nice piece of waterfront at the junction of the street, and I wanted to place this folly stair system here. And then I kind of drew this idea of, taking the budget of the concrete works and turning that into a datum which would be able to flood. So that whole base would be able to be submerged. And then create an upper structure which would be a sort of shade that would create the upper addition, which would be about timber, the assembly of timber into a geometry that would create a form that looked opaque but actually was very porous. So this idea about kind of duality of this submerged and sort of upper level object became very fascinating. And then how to make a staircase as slow as possible, to kind of make it a Juliet balcony, to bring it onto a landing, to make it into an amphitheater, to turn it around and around, became the strategy. And in the end, this is the kind of form it sort of becomes. This is the moment where you come in, kind of the furniture, there's a stair here, another furniture, kind of point of the service, an arena here. Bookshelves are allowed throughout the entire structure. There are sort of slots everywhere, and this place is a kind of Wi-Fi zone. And we gave it to the library, the local library, and they basically, with Adjaye, selected 200 books to begin with, which sort of stocked in this structure. And it's incredible how it's just kickstarted events, music, happenings, poetry readings. It became a kind of spot in the community for exchanging. So here is that sort of cast library at the base, and then the upper level. And sort of learning from those traditional structures, I think I'm very fascinated with this idea of kind of laminating and creating a crossfold out of regular pieces of timber, so not curving anything, everything is straight, but using the articulation of it and the sort of positive negative nature of the geometry to then create these vaults. So this is where we are. That's the structure here. It's the housing. I chose it because this is the kind of moment where there hadn't been much, and this would flood right up to the streets. And this is a Korean bridge, which I really love. No safety rails, and people don't fall in the river. They know how to do it. You can go down to the water. No rails, just rocks. It's astonishing. And then the structure. So the structure is sustained, creosoted to kind of allow us to preserve the timber. Here's one of those pavilions which they wanted to take away, and I absolutely insisted they kept. So you have these two moments. The foreman was amazing to get Korean carpenters to help us with this, and the engineers who created kind of setting this up. So really a kind of a standard piece of infrastructure between a podium and one of those forms of a new gateway. And when you come in, it's very compressed. Frames and more, and it opens up. So, it opens with it. And then the last project, this is the project which we completed in New York. Really our first big public project in the city. It's a Sugar Hill Harlem. There was a competition to create energy and model Broadway housing foundation to create a model of housing, an integrated urban system that would question. Jesus. Sorry. You're being really nice. You should shout. How do you say? Became a kind of model, was really a question to look at making really a housing scheme that was for getting homeless people off waiting list, people homeless and people on waiting lists to come off the waiting list, to look at the sort of housing scheme that would create access up the ladder for people in the lowest rung of that income strata. But also, it was made possible by an incredible gift by an incredible patron who bought a really beautiful site in Harlem. And so that allowed the city's tax dollars, which are there for building housing, but you can't buy property in Manhattan because it's so valuable. So most low-income housing is really difficult to build because of the land prices, not so much the architecture to build. So the gift made it possible to make this project happen. It became a kind of model for de Blasio to look at maybe how the government can incentivize and kind of intervene in creating these models. And it's created an incredible debate. This is Harlem at its beginning, and I love this image because Harlem was really a farm. And it's hard to believe that this is Harlem looking up to the north. But it was a series of incredible hamlets and farms, and was it was the high point of the city. And so it had incredible produce, but also incredible flowers were growing up here. This is Harlem now, and these are the sort of urban conditions that exist around the south. So 155th, it's in Nichols Ave. This is the structure that was built, which is a car park with Gothic sort of details. Duke Ellington kept his car here. It was really part of the Harlem Renaissance. Extraordinary place with extraordinary architecture, ways of descending down hills, turning around corners. Kind of the birthplace of, what some would describe, I describe as a kind of Afro-modernity, Afro-futurism, the beginning of a kind of an explosion of the African-American community's contribution to culture, and these great intellectuals that really have kind of helped us define civil rights, human rights, etc. And also the place where, in a way, the architecture that area, and parts of New York as well, have kind of embedded in them this, for me, this agricultural and flower, ornamental nature into the architecture, and it's become something that's kind of endearing to many communities. And so it became very interesting to me to sort of think about how to make a building which obviously solved a lot of urban issues. It was really, for me, an urban system. It would bring different age groups, it would bring childcare, it would bring art, it would bring food eating, health issues, it would bring community facilities together, but also it would also try to kind of speak to this incredible history. And I just became in the research, very fascinated by something which happens all over all over New York, but also happens very much in Sugar Hill, Harlem, is this culture of roses. And when I sort of discovered that there are these incredible sort of places where the planting happens and cultivation of roses happen, I became just really gripped, and also became very gripped about the way in which roses are in popular culture. Aretha Franklin's kind of amazing song about a rose growing out of concrete, all those kind of almost cliched but kind of roost issues, which I thought, could we look at how we could work and understand a new kind of ornament that maybe also spoke to something that was kind of very much a kind of a psyche. We found the Harlem Rose and basically started playing with it as a kind of series of perspectives. And this is actually the sort of panel that we set up as the system for the building. But essentially, it's a series of scales of roses that disappear in and out and create a sort of gradated pattern. And then we just tessellated that pattern in different ways. But we did it by making a vector drawing, a vector former, which is really a series of stratifications. It's a sort of polymer former, which basically goes against the concrete and indents it in different ways. And as you look at it in different lights or shade, you get the pattern, and it appears and disappears. So it became a kind of way of making ornament, which was not in the sort of 19th and early 20th century about kind of carving the form and letting shadow and light reveal it, but a way in which you extract from the facade and how light and shadow appear or disappear on it. And this became very fascinating to me as a kind of way of maybe speaking to the history of the area, but also creating a new way of making the skin, the masonry scheme of the building. The form of the building is, I was like, the team. The form of the building really was about creating an urban block that would allow us to make 125 units, the highest density we could make on that site. And I became really fascinated with doing two things. One, obviously acknowledging. Became very fascinated with this idea. What was that? Creating a sort of a building that would acknowledge the kind of cornice line and setback, but would not change its geometry, would just simply create the same module of sort of 1, 2, 3, 4 bedroom units in here up above, but would sort of create a kind of rotation in the form that would start to kind of speak about geometry, kind of looking back to the city at the upper level, but creating a setback on the street plane. And that masonry would sit on a very transparent base, and that base would be really the program of the support that you need for dense community housing. You know, I really don't believe that community housing can be built without the infrastructure that kind of supports it being part of the activation of the ground plane. So sectionally, you see the form of the building really. This is the housing here, and then the shift is really the same form, just rotated and shifted over, cantilevered sort of 10 feet over, to allow us to create the same relationships. And then this is a creche, this is a museum, and then you have offices, storage, and all sorts of facilities underneath it. Plan is, it just creates this kind of bar on 155th where you have on the base a courtyard of glass classrooms. The creche really has the best views over the park and the neighborhood because of the slope of 155th. It creates this extraordinary kind of ground plane with indoor courtyards that overlook it, and then you enter at the very end, sort of first door into that suite of rooms. The residents go through a compressed corridor deep into the heart of the building to go up the elevators to their apartments, and then you go through this door to the museum, which you enter here with this great elevator and lift and shop, and then you look down the shaft, which reveals the museum to you as you go in, and also this shaft, which would, at the entrance, which shows you the content of the museum. I like showing plans because people stop showing plans, so they don't look at that. You come down, the museum is really a kind of long chamber with a series of sub-chambers behind it, and there's a commercial space on the front, and offices, and education spaces, and studio spaces behind it, with the services. The apartments above the creche level are compressed around. This corridor actually expands and contracts ever so subtly, just to create perspective. And then the different apartment types are arranged, so either 3-bedroom or studios or 2-bedroom. And each one kind of playing with serration of facade, which was something I learned from the sort of visits around the street, to kind of create a system which would almost, as it were, break the sort of facade plane, but also create a relationship to the river, which is the East River, which is just here. And then really this is the plan as you go up, you come to a sort of staff office level, and then you have apartments on the other side, and then it flips, and then it goes up, and you have this kind of movement towards the east with the spaces. And then this is really looking at where the elevations go. And these are the panels that are repeated, and the variations which are created. So this is looking at 100 and, this is the same thing as that, 155th, sorry. And then this is at the bottom of the road looking at the end cable. This is looking at 155th. Oh no, this is the south, sorry, south elevation, two courtyards. And then this is 155th, the street elevation. So anyway, the street elevation is the side of the building. And traditionally this would be just a blank sort of straightforward and efficient sort of building. And we sort of pushed to create this figure that would become the profile of the building, and then perforated it as much as we could, even though this was really about privileging the corner units. And it isn't really about the way in which the architecture orientates itself. It talks about a figure, a pattern. That's the project. You can see its relationship to the city. So it's very interesting element. So it's very prominent. It's a very high point. So when you're coming into the city, if you really see it, very prominent. This was the inspiration behind the serrated facades, which I became very fascinated about, this sort of Dutch Amsterdam, but this stepping system, which happens just in very select moments, which I thought was kind of amazing. And to kind of make a mimetic topological relationship very close, I always find very interesting that sometimes you directly borrow something that is not literal, but is about the kind of way in which the proportional form system works. So the building almost looks like a stacked series of slices with its elevation, sitting on a kind of glass plane, and then obviously in the evening when this glows, you get this kind of reverse of what you think the gravity of this thing should be doing to this sort of moment. And then sort of in the light, the pattern reveals itself, or sometimes it disappears. And the plaza is just getting planted. We push the building back so that you have space. And the reason for that is to be able to allow the urban farms to then come to that plaza. So there's a kind of food education with this building. So we're actually kind of talking about sort of food health and the produce that is part of this area, still being part of that sort of public life. And then the creche spaces, offices, and the way in which the children's spaces, these are children's spaces, have this privileged view because of the slopes, they elevate and then can see the view, but adults can't peer in, which is a very important thing with kindergartens, that you don't have adults just over children. And we worked to kind of, we went to Italy to look at kind of incredible work that's been done with creches about supervision and learning, to learn to make these spaces where these are bathrooms. These are the sort of moments in which children are learning how to use bathrooms, kitchens, and courtyards that you go in and out of, and this flooded with light, sort of indoor protected and overlooked play spaces. And then the museum becomes a space where that corridor is that slot that I was showing you on the plan. It basically lights the education space for children and then leads into the museum space. So it's really what I call a light chimney. It just descends like deep into the plan and allows this inhabited street inside the basement where children can kind of break out and read and work. In the workshop and also can go to the museum. The museum is seen as a performative space, a large sort of space for program, gathering, and then traditional gallery spaces, and then that's the entrance that you come in and you go through it, sort of kind of the permanent gallery where it's the studio museum collection, which has been lent to the foundation. And then the residence corridor. This is the sort of long shaft that takes into their elevators, sort of lined with walnut. That's these apartments which have timber floors and fittings, and some people have done what they wanted there. But I have quite a lot of pictures of people's incredible habitations in these apartments. Sort of the different windows and the way in which they frame the facade and how it kind of plays with the light. Sometimes it's really revealed, and it actually becomes even more strong after the rain. It almost pops, and people are surprised about how vibrant the pattern is. And then sometimes you'll go and people say, I didn't see the pattern, and it's like a sunny day. And that sort of modularity is very interesting to me in the way in which the material doesn't have a kind of singular sort of opaque quality, but it's quite diffuse and dissolves, and almost dust-like, which can traumatize some people. Some people don't like it, of course, but I really enjoy it. And my community that I work with here really enjoy it, which was actually the bottom line of the equation. The color of the building was chosen by the community. I actually gave them a palette from red to beige to grey to black, and this was the color they all chose. So it's really funny, a lot of people think that I chose it as a building, but actually the community chose it. Great, okay, that was it. Thank you. Susan.
Okay.
Hi.
On to the important thing.
Okay.
Textiles.
Okay. Susan and I collaborated on, well, Susan actually showed me her collection. I had no idea about it and was completely blown away.
Yeah, so about 2 years ago, David and I went to our storage facility and looked at all 140 West African pieces in the collection in one marathon day. And it was really fun, David, to look at the collection with you because you have an amazing eye for quality. Do you have any training in textiles, or is it just from exposure or
No, I mean,
personal experiences?
Yeah, no, I think that textiles for me are very much, I came to them very emotionally. I don't have any formal training in textiles. I'm not a textile designer.
You are now.
Right. But I think that I was sort of, I mentioned earlier that I was, you know, as a young kid, I was born on the continent. I was born in Dar es Salaam in Tanzania, but my parents are Ghanaian, and from a very early age, my mom and my sort of extended family looked after me. I know, you know, children are always kind of wrapped in textiles. Textiles are kind of part of the sort of everyday life. Mm-hmm. And at first it seems like nothing, but I actually realized that almost from day one, my mother to this day still wears traditional cloth all the time. She's very obsessed with buying the right cloth and the right print and the meaning of the print. So I've always had this incredible relationship to pattern and texture, and it's because of her. And you know, I have a son now, and his mother now also kind of ties him up in print. And I'm sort of looking at that whole cycle happen again, and I'm sort of wondering about this. But I sort of became fascinated that somehow these patterns kind of have this kind of extraordinary quality, which can have an ability, for me, especially in African patterns, to kind of have this narrative. Most of the cloths have a kind of narrative behind it, but they have this incredible abstraction that's able to kind of literally bring people together through the material. And that became very fascinating to me.
Yeah, so in the exhibition, all of the textiles are displayed vertically, but in life, they're all intended to be worn as garments. And so I wonder what you think the pieces gain and lose by being separated from the body in that way.
Yeah, I mean, I think you actually lose a lot, not seeing how they fold and how they work with the body. But I think that what I was very much interested in doing with the show was to talk about the way in which the abstraction that you see in this work, like the sort of mathematics and the geometry, the fractalizing, the kind of power, is an incredible system. And in a way, so this idea of kind of trying to talk about it not just as a kind of intuitive process, but this incredible system that weaving and pattern making is, it's a kind of incredible intelligence for me. Sort of needed to be made, put in that plane, which kind of forces you to engage it, not just as a kind of as a cloth that's on the body. I didn't want you to think of it just as fashion, but I wanted you to think of it as systems and organizing principles.
So you've been invited by several museums at this point to kind of reinterpret their African collections. And I wonder if it was different working with a design museum as opposed to an ethnographic or anthropological collection.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the beauty of working in a design museum is that, I mean, with Berlin or Chicago, etc., one was always one was always trying to move away from the work being framed as ethnographic work, and that's always been problematic for me because I don't look at African artifacts as a kind of ethnic thing. I think of it as a kind of living contemporary art form that has this very powerful ability to use abstraction in very unique ways. So I would always go into those collections and try and move them out of that sort of way of thinking to think of them as very contemporary and very relevant to this day. So it was very nice to come to Cooper here where that wasn't the issue. So that was a very easy conversation with you and your teams, and to understand the power and the geometry of these objects, of these textiles, beyond their just use as traditional pieces of work, but as ways of looking at form and mark making.
That kind of leads into my next question, which was in your book, African Metropolitan Architecture, you talk about the multivalent consciousness of the African, which has a kind of ethnic identity as a sort of deep history, which is then overlaid with colonial history and with the contemporary condition. And I wondered if textiles like the ones in the show reside very deeply in that history layer, or do they kind of bubble up through all of the layers?
No, I think that the textiles are loaded with some of that memory in a way. They weave those issues, and I think if you look at the way textiles are made on the continent, a lot of them have the narratives kind of woven directly into them. So you are looking at kind of living art, which is trying to express its time. They are about not just making ornament, but also about expressions of the techniques and the technologies and the kind of abstractions of the time. And I find that really, really fascinating.
Yeah. When I was writing about the objects for the exhibition, one thing that I struggled with was the word tradition. Because some of these textile types have been around for 300 or 400 years or more.
Yeah.
They have this long and deep history, but traditions change and they adapt if they're still a living idea. And so I wonder how you address these deep histories without suggesting that they're static.
Well, I think that it's, for me, understanding the fundamental nature of what it is we're looking at. I love looking at history, but I'm very keen not to be mimetic with history. But I'm very, very keen to rehearse through history. So I can sometimes kind of go very close to a pattern, but then I'll want to kind of move it into a language which makes sense in my kind of thinking and in my time. So I can learn lessons, but I'm more interested in the way in which that lesson is then woven into the time that I'm in.
So a number of your buildings have a mediator that operates between the environment and the internal volume. And oftentimes those mediators are carriers of pattern. And so I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about your use of pattern in terms of light and how those mediators modulate light inside and outside, and how that relates to the pattern systems that you're using.
Yeah, I mean, I sort of have a kind of cosmology in my architecture, which is to do with the relationship to the sun, and more so the relationship to the equator is kind of what my obsession is. So the equator and how it fades. So in a way, the closer you get to the equator, the more I decouple and make two pieces of skin, and the further away you go, it becomes singular and sometimes interwoven. So in a way, like for instance, in Sugar Hill, New York, it's kind of one system, but in Washington, where it's sort of weirdly tropical, it becomes, Washington can get extremely hot and extremely cold. It's a kind of weird hybrid climate. It kind of allowed, a way for me to make a kind of tropical architecture, where it has this skin, that has this double skin. And the double skin at that moment, I think in architecture can either just be technocratic, just simply horizontal or vertical, to do with the kind of almost very kind of analog way of understanding the refraction or the reflection of the sun, which I think is very, I would say the word analog, very simplistic way of trying to kind of block the sun. But for me, there's a kind of huge tradition deeply embedded in our mental psyche, from just being in forests and being in trees, that the notion of the diffusion of light is much more complicated and mediated through shadow and pattern. So I became very fascinated that the secondary system had to kind of operate more than just a kind of device, a technical device, but it had to be a kind of carrier of messages about the human condition or the geographic condition, the intensity of light and the kind of the way it works. So, in a way, as you get closer to that equator, the skin becomes more double and maybe more dense and woven. And as you come in, it becomes more opaque, with apertures start to kind of erupt in its zenith rather than in its, I kind of have this tendency to kind of perforate the zenith, just to do with the kind of angles of light. So if you look at the trajectory of the work, it's really kind of operating between those two things, and not just there's a kind of system that we play with.
So in one of your interviews, you said that textiles can help you to resolve complex agendas in architecture. What did you mean by that?
I think that in the 21st century, we as we kind of try to evolve architecture, that much of the evolution is kind of about hybridity and colliding new conditions, new ways of reusing things, updating the way we use certain spaces. And in that hybridity, you can either kind of make a stack of differences and just express it. That's one way of looking at it. But there's only so far that I think that can work as a novelty before it becomes exhausting, just as a kind of, as a fatigue of just, piling up things. And I started to think that, that actually deep down, we also have the capacity to understand how to kind of make very complicated things have a kind of, a new singularity, a new topology. And textiles, for me, have the kind of flexibility to create that ability to maybe bring a single system that creates an identity that topology into being. So that became fascinating. Yeah. Does that make sense?
All right. So as Caroline mentioned, in conjunction with the exhibition, you designed a collection of textiles for Knoll, which were inspired by the pieces in the museum's collection. This was your first time designing textiles?
Yes. Dorothy over there made it happen from Knoll. And I find it slightly almost a deceit to say I designed them. Because I basically worked with an incredible team who listened to my whims and allowed me to, work with their incredible skill to find these things.
So, did designing specifically for the interior environment put you in a different frame of mind, or is the emotional experience of being in a place always forefront for you?
Yeah, I mean, I'm always trying not to have, even though the notion of interiority and exteriority is very important, and that distinction is very important, in a way, in my work, I'm always trying not to have that distinction. I'm more interested in scales of space. And literally outside is just another scale that happens to use the multiple styles of frame. So, and I do that deliberately because in a way I'm trying to always find systems that kind of have a language right the way through and don't sort of, bifurcate architecture into like the skin and then somebody else does the inside. I find that way of working, it can work in certain kind of worlds, but I think it's a very played out idea. And I'm more interested in an idea which tries to kind of make systems that kind of organize the way in which you sit right through to the way in which you.
So I noticed in your use of color in that collection that you often have a kind of cool and warm pairing. And I wondered if you found a parallel between working with light and working with color as kind of a similar.
For me, they're actually the same. Yeah. I mean, I don't, it's very interesting. People use color as a kind of emotional register. That's fine. For me, color is just a spectral play. So in a way, when I use color, I'm trying to illustrate the light. So it's not so much that I think blue is about unhappy and red is about danger. I actually find that not interesting at all.
That's from the teen program.
No, but it's pretty much how people think of color in that kind of emotional way. But for me, it's actually completely interesting. So for me, black is not negative. It's just the absorption of light. And usually I will go to a darker color when I'm interested in a place which has too much luminosity, and I want to kind of draw the light inwards. And I will go to a brighter color when I want to kind of create a kind of presence, a kind of physicality. So in a way, I'm always drawing the light, and the color tones are just the illustrations of it.
So another interesting feature of the collection is that it was made in 9 different mills using 9 different techniques. Why is that important to you?
It wasn't so much important to me, but what was kind of interesting was that as we kind of asked questions about what we wanted, as we asked questions about what we wanted it to be, we realized that certain mills just couldn't do what we were asking. So Dorothy and her team were amazing. They have 100 something odd mills around the world that you can work with. So we were able to just find the right mill in Italy or in America that just could help us develop that specific technique that we were searching for. You know, I asked crazy things like, we'd have an image and I'd blur it, you know, and then want to kind of restructure it, and you know, do we want it to have a kind of fabric nature or photographic nature, or, you know, asking crazy questions. So, yeah.
The textiles in the exhibition also include a very wide diversity of different materials and techniques that are local to different regions.
Yes.
Some of them are local,
Yeah.
like the mud cloth from Mali.
Yeah.
Others represent different local regions.
Yeah.
I wonder if you value this.
Yes, and in a way, I was trying to show this attitude to a kind of, I mean, I don't like the word global, I like the word planetary, geographies. Yeah, it's global kind of international idea. It's kind of physical terrain and how that kind of manifests itself. So in a way, I was also trying to talk about the way in which different materials emerge from different geographies and have different abstractions, you know, applied on them. And in a way, for me, I'm also in a way talking about how my architecture is also trying to do that. I'm trying to find a way to kind of make sense of each geography and how that impacts things.
Now, only one of the pieces in the collection has a very explicit reference to one of the Adinkra symbols, which is appropriately the symbol for a well-ventilated house. I wondered while you were working on this collection, which was, the brief was to do an inspired by collection, but I wondered what your thoughts about cultural appropriation were while you were working on it.
About cultural appropriation? What do you mean by that?
In terms of, well, there's a sort of issue around community held copyright.
Oh,
in
I
that
see.
these types of textiles are
Yeah.
not a specific design, but they're a specific repertoire of motifs and techniques that, you know, it's not one design, but you know, when you see it,
Yeah.
you see a kente cloth, you know it's a kente cloth.
Yeah.
Even though the colors might vary, the
Yes.
specific motifs might vary. And so
Uh-huh.
now there's some desire on the part of the Ashanti, for instance,
Yeah.
to be able to copyright that in some way.
Yeah, like
And so
champagne.
there's- yeah, exactly. So
Sounds smart to me.
I figured you must have given it some thought while you were working on it.
I just did it just now.
Inspired by collection.
No. No, it's great to get you to voice these things. I know you did. But I think that, you know, there are some things that emanate and have a certain kind of, you know, universal quality, of course. I mean, I think that the notion of collecting is a very troubling thing, because in a way it's a kind of moment in the kind of colonial project. And so it has a kind of specific legacy, but it's also kind of created a kind of a way to have information and knowledge. But I think that there's kind of validity in the way in which Louis Vuitton will, you know, have their logo, you know, be their logo and you can't touch it. So I can't see why the Ashanti can't have what they want to be, because I mean, it's a different timeline. I'm actually quite, you know, I always have this kind of conversation about, you know, historical things, whether you should, whether if something is just historical, you should just leave it. And I think no, I think if something becomes something to question, you should move it into a museum if it's no longer kind of public and collective, or if something is no longer kind of about how we see it in the world, then, you know, it should shift. It's tough, it's hard, it should shift. Like, I think the Elgin Marvin should go back. It should go away from the British Museum, and, you know, people should go back to Greece, and Britain should have a copy. Thank you for holding on to it for 200 years, that's great. Give it back.
Okay, I'm going to open it up to the audience now for questions. Please remember to wait for the microphone before you ask your question. Thank you.
Hi everyone, so I think we have a few minutes for questions. So if you have a question, please raise your hand and I will come to you with the mic. Any questions? All right, be right there.
How important is for you to embed a powerful and relevant narrative in the construction of your work?
Sorry, say that again. I'm
How
sorry.
important,
Yeah.
is it working?
Yeah.
How important is to embed a powerful and relevant narrative in the construction of your work?
To embed
A powerful and a powerful narrative in the construction of your work.
It's not so much about embedding it, it's about that is the way in which I creatively work. So I don't kind of take it and put it in, I kind of find it and use it as the expression. So, and for me it's not about whether the narrative has a power or not, but whether it has a relevance. So, you know, it can sometimes be something that you think is not very relevant, but actually maybe relevant in terms of its kind of ubiquity, or, you know, I'm always trying to just find the system that gives me the inspiration, not necessarily the power of the story.
And do you think this is key to produce architecture?
It's key to producing my kind of architecture. Yeah. My kind of architecture. I don't think architecture, I mean, I think everybody does architecture differently, but I find that in this time, in the 21st century, that the idea of being able to kind of understand, in a world that's becoming much more kind of universal, specificity and to create narratives is very interesting. And it's a very interesting part of architecture that's not been explored. So I think that, like all art forms, I think, you know, as a creative person, I go towards the thing that hasn't been explored, not what you think might be right. I'm not kind of interested in whether it's right or wrong, that's for historians. I'm just interested in it because it's something that needs to be looked into, and it's really inspiring.
Any further questions? There's somebody, yep. If you can stand and then just turn.
So one of the things you said that really intrigued was the idea of presenting those textiles as living things, as opposed to artifacts, as opposed to representations of traditions. And I wonder, as an artist and designer from working in a Western society that seems to have certain expectations of in curating exhibitions that brings work from non-Western countries, that in most cases there is some sort of an expectation when you say an artist from, let's say, Cairo, right? So how do you negotiate actually to bring those objects and present them in a lively manner as opposed to artifacts, as opposed to replaced and sort of projected objects?
Yeah, no, I think that's, the problem with the history of objects is that they also kind of have a history of curation. So we're also having to unpack that all the time. I think, as a kind of independent person, my job is to come in and disrupt, not to reinforce. And I don't come in to disrupt just because that's what's kind of interesting, but because in a way I'm kind of interested in finding a way to see it afresh. Like, I'm always interested in trying to look at something from the past in a way that makes it relevant to me in a contemporary way. And the way to do it is that I have to dislodge it from all its kind of narrative to then re-look at the narrative again, So I think that designers are really good, and I think the program here is part of that, like this idea of continually refreshing through a different lens, things that have a curated and cultural memory, and continually questioning that cultural memory and checking it. But I agree with you. I think I have a lot of problem when things become static. I think it dulls the kind of perception of it.
Great, thank you. So I think we have time for maybe one more question. Does anybody have another question? I know there are some folks in the back. No? All right, I don't see any questions, so thank you very much.